Yeah, thank you for coming to this talk online one day after Eintracht made the historical breakthrough in the Champions League. And today happens to be the beginning of the third season of our Sinophone Classicism talk series, which was launched last winter semester, 2021 to 22, to audience online and offline. So this semester, we're welcoming 3 excellent speakers, beginning today with Professor Tarryn Chun, Chen Limin. Tarryn received a BA from Princeton University, therefore we are also alumni, in 2006, and a PhD from Harvard University in 2016. Currently, she's an assistant professor in the Department of Film, Television, and Theater at the University of Notre Dame, where she holds a concurrent appointment in the Department of East Asian Languages and Cultures. Tarryn has published extensively on modern and contemporary Chinese theater. Her forthcoming book at Michigan University Press, Revolutionary Stagecraft, Theater, Technology, and Politics in Modern China, examines the relationship between technological modernization and artistic innovation in 20th to 21st century Chinese theater. The talk that she's going to give today is part of her ongoing project examining spectacles and excesses of extravagant performances in the PRC and beyond. This is an outstanding project. I personally like it very, very much. It is very timely as well as insightful. So I'm highly looking forward to this presentation today. As a housekeeping rule, because of the data privacy law in Germany, I must remind the audience that the talk will be video recorded and later made available on the Forschungskolleg Humanwissenschaften's YouTube channel. If you do not wish to appear in the recording, please turn off your camera. The Q&A session following the talk will not be recorded. So when you raise your question, you can unmute yourself and turn on the camera to ask the question yourself. There's no need for you to type in the question in the chat box. And please use the raise a hand button to enter the queue for the question. You will find this button on the lower panel of the Zoom screen if you click reactions. So please, Tarryn, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. I'm going to share my screen. Great. Can everyone see that? Excellent. So before I begin, just a heartfelt thanks to Professor Yang for the invitation and for the staff of the Institute for all of their help with logistics. I especially appreciate the opportunity to present on Zoom today as much as I would have loved to have joined you all in Frankfurt. I also need to acknowledge that this research is funded by a fellowship from the US National Endowment for the Humanities, with some earlier research supported by a postdoctoral fellowship from the Lieberthal-Rogel Center for Chinese Studies at the University of Michigan. And I would be completely remiss if I did not thank my wonderful research assistant, Zhiyi, for helping me to gather and process a lot of the material that has contributed to this talk today. So my talk today is part of a larger project, as Professor Yang mentioned, on spectacle and excess in global Chinese performance, which looks at the rise of the use of digital technologies in 21st century Sinophone theater from the PRC, Hong Kong, Taiwan, and in the broader diaspora. And so what I'm interested in this project is both the aesthetics of technological excess that's engendered by the large-scale application of such technologies, as well as artists. Yes.
Tarryn, if I may, I think you are a bit far away from a microphone. So, and so there are a kind of a small gaps in your voice. So maybe you would like to speak a little bit slower so we can hear you better. Yeah.
It should be my headphones. Is that better?
Maybe, yeah.
Here, hang on a sec. I'll try this. How about now? Is that better?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So the project is interested in sort of concepts of how technology has been used both to the point of aesthetic excess, as well as artists who use cutting edge technologies in more critical and complicated ways. But from the start, I want to resist these binaries that might evoke. So large versus small scale, hegemonic versus resistant, compliant versus critical, simple versus complex. And so the focus of my talk today, surface classicism and large scale tourist performance in the PRC, is specifically aiming to complicate the common perception that the spectacular application of performance technologies for more popular audiences necessarily results in a superficial flattening of literary tropes, local cultures, and symbols on stage. Or if such a flattening does exist, that doesn't necessarily warrant our easy dismissal as scholars of such phenomenon. So what I'm going to do today is first discuss the rise of tourist performance in the People's Republic of China, especially the genre known as shijingyanchu, or real scene performances, since the turn of the 21st century. And then I'm going to focus on two key characteristics of this rather sprawling genre. So first of all, how they appeal to they engage the local cultures of their specific tourist destinations, as well as how they appeal to broader and at times nationalistic senses of classicism. And second, how they use cutting-edge multimedia performance technologies in their productions. And then I will introduce this concept that I'm calling surface classicism to try to articulate the specific ways in which these two aspects of large-scale multimedia tourist performance intersect, the classicism and the use of technologies. To articulate how these not only forge a sort of sense of shared culture through the evocation of specific literary and artistic symbols, references to local culture, but also specifically and significantly in the ways that such classics are remediated via screens and other performance technologies. So in other words, classicism as remediated through specific technologies and large-scale performance has become one way of creating a shared sense of culture in our current age through these large-scale performances. And what's interesting about these particular remediations, I argue, is that they create kind of a horizontal, contemporaneous relational network that supplements, and for some audience members, may even supersede a kind of more vertical past to present intertextual connections between the contemporary performance and the literary past. So to begin, however, we need to define a few terms. So what do we mean when we're talking about tourist performance in the People's Republic of China, and specifically the genre called real scene performance, or shijingyanchu? So to contextualize this, we want to give a little bit of background about the growth of tourism and tourist performances in the last 20 years. So here's a quick graph, which I did not make myself. There's a source credited there, using data from the Ministry of Culture and Tourism that shows a steady growth in domestic tourism in the PRC from 2010 to 2019, which a precipitous decline and small rebound during the COVID-19 eras. And despite this recent dip and the effects of COVID-19 on tourism, Minister of Culture and Tourism Hu Heping has, as recently as December 2020, predicted that there will continue to be a strong rebound in domestic tourism, with consumption reaching 10 trillion yuan, or about 1.5 trillion US dollars within the next 5 years. Similarly, the 14th five-year plan, which was issued in March 2021, targets domestic tourism as a major growth industry. As reported by the South China Morning Post, for example, during the 2021 to 2025 period, the country will, quote, fully enter the era of mass tourism, and the domestic market, particularly rural tourism, including cultural and outdoor recreation, will develop significantly. So, in line with this growth of tourism and the predicted continued growth of tourism in the PRC, there has been an increasing emphasis in the tourism industry on the intertwinement of culture and tourism. And we see this not least of which in the recent retitling of the Ministry of Culture and Tourism, the Wenhua he Luyou Bu, which was made by the merger of the former Ministry of Culture and the National Tourism Administration in 2018. And theater and performance have long played an important role in tourism in China, with small-scale shows frequently featured at tourist destinations, classical performance often marketed to foreign tourists, and now this growth of a new genre. So, for example, if you look back earlier in the 2010s, there was a really well-known production in the Imperial Granaries in Beijing of the Kunshu Mudanting that was largely marketed to foreign tourists, but lasted for 6 to 10 years or so. There has also been a similar trend in theme park entertainment throughout China to incorporate performances on a number of levels. So for example, a recent article by Kirk Denton and Yichun Xu discusses a number of different performances in the Luxun themed theme park in Shaoxing. So this includes sort of scenes from Luxun short stories, actors in character as Hu and others wandering around the town, and most recently, this large-scale production called Luzhen Shexi, the village opera of Lu Town, that is named after one of Luxun's famous essays about encountering local opera as a boy. This premiered in April 2021, and I believe currently is not performing, but it is a large-scale indoor production that draws inspiration from Luxun's oeuvre and his life, and uses a number of large LED screens as one of the primary scenographic components. It's also marketed specifically as a 大型实景演出, which links it to this broader genre of real scene performances that has been in circulation at tourist destinations in the PRC since the early 2000s. Now, this genre is a little bit difficult to pin down. In the literature and in the publicity for performances, you will see a number of different terms used to refer to this style of performance. Sort of base term is 实景演出, but sometimes the monikers large scale 大型 or landscape 山水 are attached to us. There are also other permutations. But the defining features of this genre, very broadly writ, are that it's often at popular tourist destinations, often either outside against natural landscape, hence the 山水, or in an interior space that is created to, speaking too quickly, or in an interior space that is recreates the landscape through use of scenography and other sort of decoration. It also makes an attempt to translate local culture or cultural practices onto the stage. There are a number of Chinese scholars who have researched this genre extensively and tried to divide it sort of into different subgenres. For example, exterior versus interior, 室外 versus 室内, or to parse the difference between a landscape specific 实景演出 and one that is not landscape specific. So I am not going to go into the particularities of all of the different genre nuances today. For the purposes of my talk here, what's important is that this genre, broadly writ, has grown in importance and number dramatically since its introduction in 2004. So the first performance that is credited as a real scene performance, or 实景演出, was 印象流三节, which premiered in 2004 in Guilin. And this particular production was originated by a cultural official named Mei Shuaiyuan, who collaborated with the well-known filmmaker Zhang Yimou to premiere 印象流三节 and sort of inaugurate this new style of performance. And Mei Shuaiyuan was inspired to do this by his past work with some of the performing arts troupes in Guangxi, but also by his experiences visiting different locations related to the Chinese tradition, Chinese classical tradition, like Dunhuang, and also seeing Broadway musicals in New York. And so from the beginning, this genre is designed as a kind of admixture of local custom, the classical quote unquote tradition broadly writ, and performance design inspired by large-scale Broadway style musical theaters. He was especially inspired by Cats, which is a topic for a paper in and of itself. Now, over the last decade and a half, this genre has grown to include two main producing companies, one of them run by Mei Shuaiyuan, which is this one here, the Shanxi Shengdian Gongsi, and another company run by Zhang Yimou and his two collaborators, Wang Qiaoge and Fan Yue. And these two production companies are responsible for the large majority of this style of performance, but not all of them. There are a number of spin-offs throughout the country. Some of the more famous ones, and I'm going to run through them relatively quickly here, are Impression Westlake, which takes place at the famous Shihu outside of Hangzhou. It was retooled in 2016 as Hangzhou, a living poem, Zhiyi shi Hangzhou, in honor of the G20 summit that was held in Hangzhou that year. There's another one called The Song of Everlasting Sorrow, which is located just outside of Xi'an. The Great Song, Dream of Splendor of the Eastern Capital in Kaifeng. There's a whole sub-series called Youjian, or Encore, also produced by Zhang Yimou, Wang Chaoge, and Fan Yue's company. These are more interior performances, but they are site-specific. They're bespoke theaters built at important tourist destinations like Pingyao and Wutai Shan. These ones especially often incorporate also local religious customs. We have more recently the Return to the Three Gorges, Guilai Sanxia, which is based on a series of 10 poems that are related to the Three Gorges region. And here I just, with the help of my RA, put together a quick Google map that shows some of the destinations that feature these large scale performances. And part of the larger project is actually going to be compiling a data set that has locations, productions, personnel, and run dates so that they can be used for GIS and network analysis. This is just a very rudimentary start to that part of the project. But basically, the point here is that by the 2020s, the popularity and the profit of this style has led to what Chinese dance scholar Wang Keyue refers to in a 2022 article as a shijingyan shu chao, or a fervor for real scene performances, which perhaps not coincidentally parallels the recent fervor for classicism that we see in China and the broader Sinosphere. And I do want to acknowledge just briefly that COVID has had an impact on these performances. Many of them have temporarily stopped, and it's yet to be seen whether or not they will be revived, but it has not completely put a stop even to the premiere of new performances. So even since the beginning of the pandemic, we've seen the premiere of the Luzhen Shi performance in Shaoxing. There's a performance called Chongqing 1949 that also premiered in 2021. And there's one called The Most Memorable Shaoshan, Zhiyi Shaoshan Chong, that premiered also in 2021. There's another picture from it, and Bainian Shiguang also premiered in 2021. Perhaps sort of side note, we can also see a trend toward the move into more revolutionary history, and the melding of the sort of classical ethos with the revolutionary history is something I'll circle back to at the very end of the presentation. So there are an enormous number of performances in this genre, and they certainly do not all conform to a single model or a single aesthetic. But if we look at them in aggregate, a couple of important key characteristics do emerge. One has to do with the tourism industry, the economics of the productions, the issue of exploitation of local cultures and local populations. This is an important area of research. A lot has been done here. It's not the focus of my talk today. Another set of questions has to do with the aesthetics of the productions, and especially how they combine cultural engagement with cutting-edge, spectacular performance technologies. So you can see just an example of some of the cutting-edge, spectacular performance technologies playing here, and I've lowered the volume so that I can speak over this clip. And this is from the Store in Stone by Nian Shiguang from 2021, which was done as actually part of a horticultural expo in Nanjing. All right, so engaging with tradition, quote unquote, is a key point in these productions, and it's quite a purposeful component of how they are written, created, and marketed to tourist audiences. And what's important here is that the engagement with tradition is both, it's a mixture of incorporating what's been defined as quote unquote local culture, so folklore, regional culture, Shaoshu Minzu or ethnic minority practices in areas where that's relevant, and also connecting to literary works, visual art, historical figures and cultural symbols that have been legitimated as representative of a, quote, national Chinese cultural canon through things like state promotion, publication and inclusion in textbooks, exhibition in state-sponsored museums, and things like that. And so the balance or the contrast, or maybe even conflict at times, between local culture and the broader national literary and artistic canon, and I'm saying these terms very carefully and in quotation marks throughout, can be seen both within individual productions and across different productions. So for example, what we have here are two images on the left-hand side of the screen from Impression Liu Sanjie and Impression Li Jiang, which focus more on the, quote, local customs and even ethnic minority way of life in the regions when they premiered. Whereas the ones on the right, which come from The Song of Everlasting Sorrow and The Return to the Three Gorges, make more direct reference to the classical poetic tradition via their titling after Bai Juyi's Changhenge in one case, and in the specific evocation of poetry related to the Three Gorges region in the other. And as scholars such as Wang Keyue and Xu Linzhou have noted, classicist references occur both on the level of content and form. Wang Keyue, for example, describes how the Shijing Yanshu actually attempt to translate artistic and poetic concepts, like the relationship between shu and shi, or the sort of empty and full, or virtual and concrete, into the production design, as well as the painterly concept of liu bai, or sort of leaving a blank space to fill in with the imagination. Similarly, Xue Linzhou, who writes about Zhang Yimou's film more broadly, has talked about the use of yijing in the impression series that Zhang Yimou helms, which Zhou translates as a sort of poetic state. But basically, the argument there is that Zhang Yimou is actually very consciously trying to use modern technology to integrate classical artistic concepts into these large-scale tourist performances as a means of appealing to both domestic and international audiences. And indeed, because of the outdoor locations of these productions and the use of landscape in their title, the vast majority of work that's already been done on these productions discusses connections between the genre and things like Chinese landscape painting and poetry. There are also comments by the creators that suggest there is sort of a Confucian and or Taoist philosophical bent. But one of the things that I want to point out as going forward is that a lot of these arguments, and even the way that the creators themselves use these classical concepts, seem to be on a relatively superficial level. They're evoked or invoked, but not often described at depth. So this raises the question of how deeply are these large-scale tourist performances actually engaging with the classical tradition, or in other cases with local cultures and customs. Regardless of this depth question, which we're going to come back to in a minute, the combination of direct references to literary and artistic works from a recognizable classical canon, as well as perceived attempts to translate quote unquote quintessentially Chinese principles from poetry, aesthetics, and philosophy to the stage, places this genre of the Shijing Yanshu, the real scene performances, squarely into the realm of classicism. And it raises questions about not only the depth of engagement with classicism, but also what is the relationship, what is the precise relationship between the way that these productions invoke the classics and how they are using high-tech, cutting-edge performance technologies and media in their scenography and modes of performance. So the performance technologies are also an equally important feature of these productions, as you saw from the clip that I just played. And I just wanted to briefly note that in the title here for my presentation, I've used the term multimedia because not all of these productions might fall into the category of what we would identify as specifically digital performance, but many of them do rely in some way on digital technologies, whether that's in the use of digital technologies on stage or in backstage technologies. And I'm happy to talk more about the sort of various terms that exist to describe theater that engages with media and technology in the Q&A if that's of interest. But what's important to note here is that in the advertising, the marketing, the brief descriptions, not only of the individual productions, but also of the companies themselves, the technology is almost always highlighted. So here we have just half a quote from the website for Zhang Yimou's company, the Sanxiang Yinxiang Producing Company, which again is responsible for a large number of this style of performance. And in the company description itself, not only does it talk about connecting to local culture, to environment and landscape, to broader Chineseness, but also notes that not only do they use important performance technologies, but they have been responsible for inventing a range of new technologies for stage performance through the production of these. So innovation, invention in the realm of performance technologies is a core component of how the companies and how the productions see themselves as contributing to contemporary theater and art. Some of the many performance technologies that are commonly found across these performances include projection and projection mapping. So that's when the projection is sort of fit to an element of pre-existing landscape, like the contours of the side of a mountain, for example, or onto water fountains spraying up from the surface of a river or a pool or a lake. We also frequently see revolving or mechanized stages of some way. So either the platform on which the actors are standing turns, or it lifts up and moves down. This is also a feature of a lot of large interior theaters these days. A performance technology that the Sanxiang Yinxiang company claims to have sort of pioneered is that of the revolving auditorium. So rather than the stage moving, the audience seating area actually turns around, allowing there to be effectively a 360-degree panorama stage surrounding the audience area that they can be turned to see different points of at different parts of the performances. LED screens, larger and brighter, the larger and larger and brighter are also a major component, and these are increasingly used in these performances, as well as behind the scenes components like computer controlled lighting, sound, even sometimes surveillance systems used to sort of track performers, because another feature of these shows is that they are often had casts in the tens or hundreds of performers. So this is important just also because this is not a phenomenon that's unique to these productions. We've seen an increased use of performance technologies throughout Chinese performance in the last 2 decades, especially. It also connects, as media scholar Audrey Yue has noted, connects these performances to the increasing ubiquity of screens in public life in the PRC. So screens in squares, in subway stations, even the screens that we carry around in our pockets. And so there are a lot of connections between the growth of performance technologies and the sort of shifting media scape in terms of material technologies in PRC more broadly. This does not make technology any less a key defining feature of this particular genre. And the important thing is that not only is it touted as a defining characteristic, but it's also trends in its use towards the spectacular, and therefore becomes a main focus of audience attention. So this creates a tension then between the idea of a potentially deep engagement with the classics and this very visually stunning, potentially superficial aspect engendered by the sometimes ostentatious use of cutting edge technologies. And even in some of the images that I flashed briefly before, you can see how in some of these productions, the visuality, especially the technologized visuality, almost seems to take over the stage at times. And this indeed has led to a sort of divergence in responses to the performances. So on one hand, the visual splendor specifically enabled by technologies often is what draws audience members to these productions and what they complement afterwards. But we also find more critical voices. So for example, Audrey Yue has written about the Impression series in the context of large screens in China. And one of the things that they notice is that respondents to some of these productions, like Hainan Island, which is one of the Impression series productions, criticize the use of technology because it seems to sort of vacate the content. So it's almost a replacement. There's technology and spectacle instead of content. The shows seem empty because of the use of technology. Similarly, there's often a sense that the representations has become vulgar or flattened or even essentialized. And indeed, a main critique of these productions is the way that they represent local cultures and the sort of tension between the producing companies and the actors, who in some of them are locals who are not trained performers. Again, not quite the focus of what I'm talking about today, but it's certainly an important critique of these performances. And as Julian Zhou puts it, in these series, especially Zhang Yimou's Impression series, the past is used to serve the present, but they point out it's more on the level of likeness than on the deeper level of spirit. So again, we have the surface to depth contrast embedded within the critiques, and that the spectacle does not produce emotions, which again, in the scholar's view, is one of the main goals of classical poetry, which they refer to here as ancient poetry. And so again, this tension between surface and depth, which seems somehow to be pinned on the fact that multimedia technologies are the mode of mediation between the classics and the contemporary audience. So the superficiality of engagement with culture broadly writ at the same time seems to implicate performance technology in this superficiality or flattening. So what are we to make then of the fact that the spectacular use of technology in large-scale tourist performance seems to go hand in hand with a superficial appropriation of classical aesthetics, poetics, symbols, and images? Professor Yang has pointed out in her work on classicism that classicism itself is prone to critiques of being derivative and inauthentic, that this idea that when we reuse the classics in some way, we're replacing a kind of erudite allusion with more direct reference or easier to understand, therefore more fake and inauthentic sort of engagement with the past. Similarly, because so many of these technologies are playing across the surfaces of things, they are employing LED screens, they are projected onto mountains or waters. These productions also veer into another parallel area of critique where the sort of external experience of things is seen to be easily manipulated. And so a lot of scholarship and theory that works on ornamentalism and sort of surface detail has talked about this idea that surfaces seem to evoke superficiality, that we forget that there is a depth beneath the skin or the surface. Added to that, the fact that these productions are at tourist destinations for popular audiences, despite the fact that scholarship has done much to complicate the idea of the tourist gaze, as in the work of Jonathan Uri and others, and the idea that popular culture is somehow lowbrow, there are still these multiple ways in which the components of the Shijing, the real scene performances, sort of combine to speak to easy dismissal, to be superficial appropriations of classical culture and nothing more. However, as media scholar Giuliana Bruno reminds us, in visual culture, surface matters, and it does have depth. And this is perhaps even more important when visual culture is married to performance with all of its corporality, liveness, and real-time experience of audience members. And so what I'd like to suggest in the sort of last bit of my talk is that surface classicism, this term that I've proposed in the introduction, is a way of thinking through the specific ways in which classicism is operating in these performances, and also can point to some ways in which we might move past this impulse to dismiss these productions too easily because of their seeming superficiality and overuse of ostentatious performance technologies. So how am I doing on time? Okay, so let's look quickly at one example. So we might turn to, for example, Westlake, which is one of the most iconic topoi in the Chinese landscape, and also one of the more popular tourist destinations in mainland China. This site is important because, as Eugene Wang has written, it's etched in collective memory by its capacity to inspire writings on it and the topical thinking that it provokes. So Westlake has featured in visual art, in poetry, it pops up in folklore, it's a major location in the legend of the white snake, which is performed across different shichu genres and appears in many different literary genres as well. And since 2007, it's also been the site of nightly performances of the, Impression Westlake, which I showed you earlier, which takes place literally on the surface of the lake in a sort of little inlet just to the side of the main West Lake. The original version of the production ran from 2007 to 2016, and then it was retooled for the G20 summit in September 2016. And so in the original Impression Westlake, I'm going to show you a video clip in just a minute. Digital enhancement features primarily behind the scenes in computer-controlled lighting technology, but also visibly in an opening prelude to the performance, where we see projection onto a moon-shaped screen on the surface of the water. And you can hear in the background all of the audience members because this is audience taken footage of the show. So this moon appears with various poetic images, a crane flying, a bridge, and then text appears. Text that reads, "A lake, a thousand-year lake, mystical and distant, mystery of mysteries, at last magically appears. The elegance of numerous dynasties, the flourishing of many eras, who's lucky enough to fully understand? Imagine if there were a white crane in the heavens who like an immortal came down. Now, is it looking down on the joys and sorrows of the whole human world? Is it joining the development of a legend? Is it gathering up a moment from 1,000 years ago and flying into the present?" So in this moment, we have a specific type of technological mediation, a projection, also bringing not only images from classical canon, but also a sort of poetic preface into the world of the performance. But notably, this is not exactly a classical style poem. If it were, we would expect classical or forms that are recognizable as classical. So for example, the 律诗 or maybe tetrasyllabic verse. We would also expect specific allusions following rules of rhetoric, composition, structure appropriate to the form chosen. And we do have in this text a sort of one reference to Lao Tzu in the third line where I stopped the video, the 玄之又玄. But for the most part, the projected text works in broader tropes rather than precise allusions. A thousand-year lake, so that's the Shihu, but it could be any lake. Dynasties past, a white crane, which is again a pretty common symbol across poetry and painting, the joys and sorrows of the human world. So again, and we have things like a little bit of repetition, a few lines that almost function as a couplet. The way the lines are broken mark the text as poetry, not prose, but again, without any kind of formal precision. And so what's interesting about this is that the poetic images then are also paired with these landscape images, some of which are painterly and some of which are photography, that again evoke some of Westlake's really iconic images, bridges, a flying crane, the moon reflecting on the water. And throughout the production, we sort of seen similarly loosely elusive images in the actual vignettes that are performed for the audience members. So what I want to suggest here is that the fact that this is not strict classicalism is actually significant. And the fact that it is projected on this moon-like surface on the surface of the water, so a doubling of surfaces, is also significant. And the term that I'm using to describe this, surface classicism, attempts to evoke both the literal use of surfaces and the sort of seeming superficiality of the referencing that's going on. So again, if we mine this densely for illusions, we're going to run into roadblocks. They are there, but they are so broad as to be both easily recognizable and imprecise. Now, the term surface classicism was actually coined by an art historian named Erwin Panofsky to describe imitation in proto-Renaissance art and architecture. And what's interesting about that is he sees it as a kind of immaturity of classicism. But in this case, my use of the term surface classicism doesn't, I'm not trying to pass any kind of value judgment on the use of it, but rather to capture the fact that it is precisely the pairing of a seemingly surface level engagement with classical art, literature, and culture, and the essential role of technology enhanced surfaces, which is especially screens, but not limited to that surface, as a mediating device for that classicism. So in this case, surface classicism takes on a kind of dual meaning, both the superficiality and the literal use of surfaces in order to mediate the classics. And of course, in Impression Westlake, this happens on a very material level with the production happening both on the surface of the water and also employing these projection surfaces throughout it. And this doubling or tripling of surfaces suggests that one of the key characteristics of surface classicism is that it is layered, but not necessarily densely nuanced, that we can pick apart the layers, but what we might find is that we have actually a layering of broad allusions and broad references throughout. Another key component of it is that, if we're talking about the relationship and sort of poetics of these performances, we are also seeing the ornamentalism that is a key component of much classical poetry and art, sublimated away from the literary references within the performances into the use of performance technologies. And so as this particular production goes on, we see the use of candy colored lights, the sort of there's a moment when I'm trying to say, like a waterfall rises out of the surface of the water. And so all of these sort of technological tricks, again, it's a kind of movement of the ornamentation from the literary into the world of performance technologies. Just trying to keep an eye on time. And we can see this too, even in the remount of the production that happens in 2016 for the G20 summit. And what's particularly interesting about the new version of the Westlake show is that it moves the classical poetic reference into the title of the production. So the original title is 印象西湖 or Impression Westlake, and the new version is called 最意是杭州. And this is a direct reference to a set of poems by Tang Dynasty poet by Zhiyi that talks about recalling Jiangnan. And so you'll see here, for those of you who can read the Chinese, that title, 最意是杭州, is actually in the poem. And so it excerpts that out and makes it the title of the production, as though saying, this form of performance is the new classical poetry. What's also particularly interesting about this is that it moves more into an internationalist vein. So not only does it feature references to the classical Chinese tradition, local Hangzhou culture, but it also features ballerinas doing Swan Lake and ends with Beethoven's Ninth. And so this is a sort of obvious move to retool it for the international audience at the G20 summit. So in one sense, the argument that I'm putting forward here might be criticized for just coining new jargon to describe something that's quite obvious. But what I'd like to suggest is that focusing on surface qualities of classicism, especially in the real scene performances or the Shijing Yanchu, also gestures towards new and potentially productive ways of understanding how classicism operates in the current age. And so for the last sort of 10 minutes of my talk or so, maybe a little less than 45, I want to point out just a few ways in which the Shijing Yanchu's specific brand of classicism relates to concepts of Chineseness, to revolutionary classicism, and also to the role of remediation in creating a sense of shared contemporary culture in the PRC today. So the first of these we might think of as a kind of national genre. Now, with the Shijingyanshu, as I've noted, they are throughout China. There are a huge number of them today. But one of the main ways that they've been interpreted, in addition to the sort of critiques of superficiality, has been in relation to attempts to forge forms of Chineseness. So Xue Lingzhou reads Zhang Yimou's impression series, for example, as an attempt to, quote, appropriate ancient aesthetics and legends in an attempt to assert authentic forms of Chineseness in an age of national and international tourism. So that's one of the ways that these productions have been interpreted. In the co-producer's own writings, however, for example, especially the work of Mei Shuaiyuan, who has published a lot about these productions, it's not just about a sort of authentic form of Chineseness exactly, and I would put authenticity in quotes here as well, but the idea of creating a genre of performance that is unique from anything else that you can find anywhere in the world. So inspired by the classical Chinese tradition, inspired by local customs, inspired by Broadway musicals, but which can become a kind of a Chinese brand. Mei Shuaiyuan talks about how both the aesthetics of the productions are indebted to Chinese culture, but also the practical components are those that cannot be done anywhere else in the world. They are too big, the technology is too new and innovative, and this would be prohibitive in a practical sense in many of the other places where you might find large-scale performance. As Wang Yue points out, this makes the Shijingyanshu a kind of IP or intellectual property, and one that can potentially be exported. And so we actually have seen this. There was one impressions series performance in Malacca, Malaysia, and there is one done by Mei Shuaiyuan's company in Vietnam. And so there is a sort of sense of a kind of like national culture as national brand. And so this raises questions of the relationship between classicism and consumerism and what it means to brand not the Chinese classical culture, but this specific performance version of classical Chinese culture as a national genre or a national brand. There's another level, and this relates to the sort of question of revolutionary classicism, on which surface classicism enables an unlikely marriage of traditions that have been long established as opposing, a sort of the convergence, and we might use theories of convergence culture here to describe this, of classical poetry and revolutionary history. So of course, there is plenty of precedent for this, right? Mao Zedong's classical style poetry, other phenomena from the early to mid 20th century that are now receiving more scholarly attention. But in the Shijingyanshu, what we have is in the sort of flattening and appropriation of only surface level elements of classicism, a more easy portability from a quote classical context into a revolutionary one. And we see this in one recent production, Zhiyi Shaoshan Chong, which combines the Bai Zhiyi poem title appropriated from Zhiyi Shi Hangzhou with the revolutionary birthplace of Mao Zedong. And so I have not seen this one yet because I have not been able to go to China in the last year or so, but you can see even in the still image from it, how we have the sort of elements that echo things we see in other Shijingyanshu, like the performance on water with the sort of projection of calligraphy in a way that sort of marries these two aesthetics. Again, the very superficiality enabling them to be combined in a way that maybe wouldn't hold if we were to adhere to our more typical ideas of revolutionary classical as being opposing, or even the sort of like intricacies of form that we would get into in analyzing revolutionary poetry. The last point that I want to make here, just really quickly before I conclude, is that remediation in surface classicism is also a key component. And so in the often cited definition by J. David Bolter and Richard Grusin, remediation is defined as a representation of one medium within another, which engenders a tension between the desire to erase the medium traces or to call attention to the presence of mediums and acts of mediation. So if we focus on surfaces themselves in the real scene performances or the Shijingyanshu, we find that the acts of remediation are in fact what are repeated across different performances. So just one real quick example to go back to the clip of Impression Westlake. The first image that we saw here is this moon-shaped screen with a projection of a bird, which is a crane, on it. If you look across other performances, for example, Return to the Three Gorges, we see not just the image or the trope of the crane evoked, but specifically the projected image of the crane onto a moon-like surface, repeated almost as if excerpted from the screenshot that I just shown you. It's flying in a different direction and it's painterly rather than filmic, but the repetition of not just the symbol, but the specifically technologically remediated version of that symbol is repeated across performances. And we see this with other things too. The most obvious example is the LED scroll from the 2008 Olympics, but that appears in a number of Shijing Yanshu, as well as in performances that are more sort of properly theatrical, taking place in large theaters, touring, having limited runs. We also see it in projected calligraphy script on the sides or integrated into performances as in the Shaoshan production that I just showed you. So what I think that this does ultimately is it creates a sort of second network of associations. So if typically when we're talking about classicism, we're thinking about allusion to the past. So we're reaching back vertically into the past, looking for intertextual connections between the present image and the past image, whether in poetry or art. What the Shijing Yanshu, and I think actually contemporary performance culture in China more broadly does, is also creates a horizontal and contemporaneous network among remediations of these tropes in the same genre and across different genres. And through this horizontal contemporaneous network, we actually find an echoing of earlier practices where these remediations can circulate and be recognized by contemporary average audience members, regardless of how deeply they understand the intertextual, historical, classical allusions that are being made. And in this, maybe we're almost remediating sort of mode of classical engagement where text and image circulates among communities of viewers, of readers, of writers, of artists, but in a very specifically digitally and technologically remediated way. All right, I think I'm a little bit over time, so I'm going to pause and stop sharing my screen, but thank you all so much for listening. And this is quite work in progress, so I welcome any and all questions and feedback. Thank you.